I was standing on the balcony of a glass-walled skyscraper, the city glittering beneath me like a sea of second chances. 10 years ago, I couldn't afford a bus ticket. Now my name, Anna Reyes, was etched on the 32nd floor, right beneath founder and CEO. Below, the ballroom throbbed with music and soft laughter. The lights spelled out success in warm gold. The gala was in my honor, the Little Phoenix 10-year gala, a celebration of our expansion into international markets. Photographers waited. Investors circled. Journalists had their headlines ready. The woman who built an empire from ashes. But I wasn't thinking about headlines. I was thinking about the one person who had taught me what ashes felt like. Anna? A voice said behind me. It was careful. Familiar. It struck my chest before it reached my ears. I turned. My ex-husband, Richard Reyes, stood in the doorway. For a second, the past tried to drag me backward. Not tonight. The sharp suits were gone. The easy arrogance had drained away. He wore a cheap blazer and a face that couldn't hold my eyes. Thinner, older. Consequences had a way of carving a man. I heard about your company, he said. I wanted to see you. To talk. That word had been missing when I was sick, pregnant, and broke. Missing when our accounts were empty. Missing when he left me to give birth alone. Why now? I asked. He swallowed. I made mistakes. I didn't know what I had. I just want a chance to make things right. 10 years ago, I begged him to stay. I cried myself to sleep and wondered what I had done wrong. Tonight, the roles had switched, and all I felt was distance. I stepped closer until the city lights framed his face. The music inside thinned to a hum. You don't understand, I said, calm and clear. The woman you left behind doesn't exist anymore. She died the day you walked out. His mouth opened, then closed. Nothing came. I turned from him and walked back toward the ballroom. Past the orchids, past the cameras, past the young publicist waiting with a list of names and a perfect smile. Ms. Reyes, she said, they're ready for you. I'm ready for them, I answered. Behind me, the balcony door sighed shut. The man who once abandoned me stood alone, outside the life he traded away. I didn't look back. Not then. I should have. Tonight was the beginning. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. I grew up in a 2-room apartment above a laundromat where the walls sweated in summer and the pipes clanged in winter. My mother worked nights at the care home. My stepfather fixed cars for cash. We were not poor in spirit, but money always felt like a rumor that never reached our street. I learned early to stretch rice, mend seams, and smile even when the cupboard looked back at me with nothing much to say. I met Richard at the community college registration line. He had a cocky smile and a clean white shirt that looked like it had never met a stain. Business major, he said, tapping the form like it was already a diploma. I was studying bookkeeping and working the morning shift at the bakery. He walked me to the bus stop that first day and told me I was the kind of girl success looks good next to. I laughed, but some part of me believed him. We married in the town hall with borrowed flowers and a sheet cake I iced myself. He kissed my forehead and said, "Give me a few years. Anna, we'll leave these cracked sidewalks behind." I said yes to everything. Yes to his plans. Yes to his long nights networking. Yes to taking a second job so he could focus on the big picture. I learned QuickBooks at night, balanced his invoices on my lunch breaks, and brought sandwiches to whatever dusty office he called an incubator. When money was short, I sold my grandmother's locket. When rent went up, I moved us farther from the bus line and walked. When he said clients were this close to signing, I nodded and made beans stretch one more day. People told me I was loyal. I told myself I was building a life. On Sundays, we sat on milk crates in our living room and shared takeout noodles. He would point at the ceiling and say, "Penthouse. Give me time." I would rest my head on his shoulder and answer, "I'm not going anywhere." I meant it. I thought he did too. Back then, love was a promise that tasted like steam and soy and hope. Back then, I believed the worst storms could be waited out if you held hands tight enough. I didn't know yet that some storms walk out wearing your husband's coat. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. A missed dinner here, a forgotten birthday there. At first, I brushed it off. Richard was building a business, after all. Long hours and endless networking were part of the package. But soon, the silences started to stretch between us, filling the spaces where laughter used to live. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped noticing the little things I did to keep us afloat. The packed lunches, the carefully balanced budgets, the sleepless nights spent working freelance bookkeeping gigs to pay off his business loans. "You worry too much," he'd say whenever I asked about overdue bills or maxed out credit cards. Big moves take big risks. I told myself he was right. Maybe I did worry too much. Maybe all great entrepreneurs started this way, broke, exhausted, one deal away from success. But when I found a collection notice shoved in the back of his desk drawer, one he hadn't even bothered to open, something deep inside me shifted. Fear, I realized, was starting to replace faith. Then came the investment pitch. Richard wanted to refinance the apartment to inject more cash into his expansion plan. He stood in the kitchen waving a stack of papers, his eyes bright with conviction. "This is how people get rich, Anna. This is how we make it big. But what if it doesn't work?" I asked. "We could lose everything," he sighed, the kind of sigh that made me feel small, ungrateful. "This is exactly why I don't tell you things," he muttered. "You don't believe in me." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city below. I did believe in him. I always had. But belief without trust was a house with no foundation, and for the first time, I felt ours starting to crack. The next morning, I signed the refinance papers. My hands were trembling the whole time. I told myself it was an investment in our future. Deep down, though, it felt like placing a bet I was destined to lose. 3 months later, the ground beneath my feet collapsed. Not all at once, but piece by piece. First, the expansion plan Richard was so sure about vanished without a trace. The investors pulled out. The new contracts he bragged about never materialized. And the money, our money, my inheritance from my late mother, the equity from the apartment, was gone. "I just need a little more time," he said one evening, pacing the living room with his phone glued to his ear. "These things take patience." But I could hear the edge in his voice, the desperation under the smooth promises. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter. Debt collectors started calling. And Richard stopped coming home altogether. When he was home, he was a stranger, distracted, irritable, distant. He snapped when I asked questions and rolled his eyes when I suggested getting a regular job to help cover expenses. "I'm not meant to work a 9 to 5, he said one night, laughing bitterly. "I'm building an empire. Empires don't get built by flipping burgers." But it wasn't just the money anymore. It was the whispers, hushed phone calls in the hallway, texts he quickly deleted, weekends at business retreats that he never explained. One night, I followed a hunch and checked our joint bank account. My breath caught when I saw a $5,000 withdrawal, one I hadn't authorized, spent on a hotel suite in a nearby city. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. "You don't understand," he said flatly, packing a suitcase without meeting my eyes. "I need to feel alive again." "I can't do that here." Tears blurred my vision. "So you're leaving? Just like that? After everything we've built?" He paused at the door, his expression unreadable. "You'll be fine, Anna. You always are." And just like that, he walked out, leaving me in the ruins of the life we had built together. No apology. No explanation. Just silence. That night, I sat on the kitchen floor surrounded by unpaid bills, an empty bank account, and a heart that felt like it had been hollowed out from the inside. The breaking point had come, and it had broken me. The days that followed blurred into one another, a haze of grief, disbelief, and humiliation. I kept expecting Richard to come back. Some part of me clung to the idea that this was just a temporary break, that he'd walk through the door one night with flowers and apologies. But days turned to weeks, and weeks turned into months. And the only thing that showed up was another eviction notice. I had nothing left. No savings, no job, no partner. Even my body had betrayed me. 2 weeks after Richard left, I found out I was pregnant. The test turned positive in a cramped bathroom, the same day the bank froze our account due to unpaid loans. I remember staring at the 2 pink lines and laughing, a bitter, broken laugh that didn't sound like my own voice. I called him. Again and again. He never answered. Finally, after weeks of silence, I received a text. "I'm sorry, Anna, I can't do this. I need space to figure out my life. Don't contact me." Those 3 words hit harder than any betrayal. This wasn't a husband who'd made a mistake. This was a man who had erased me, erased us, the moment things got hard. My pregnancy was brutal. Alone and uninsured, I worked night shifts at a grocery store and spent my days sewing clothes for extra cash. There were nights I went to bed hungry so I could save enough for prenatal checkups. And there were mornings when I stared at myself in the mirror, pale, exhausted, and swollen, wondering how the woman I used to be had vanished so completely. But amid the despair, something small and stubborn began to take root. A thought I repeated to myself on the loneliest nights. He left me at my lowest. But that's not where my story ends. It was a whisper then, fragile and uncertain, but it would grow into resolve, into strength, into something Richard never expected. And one day, it would become the reason I'd no longer cry his name. I'd make him remember mine. By the time my daughter Lena was born, I was a ghost of the woman I'd once been. I brought her home from the hospital wrapped in a donated blanket to a 1-room apartment with peeling paint and a leaky faucet. There were no flowers, no visitors, no proud father pacing the hallways. Just silence, heavy and suffocating, and a baby who depended on me for everything. Those first months were a brutal test of survival. I learned how to stretch $1 to feed us both, how to nurse while answering customer emails from my secondhand laptop, how to smile through tears when Lena smiled at me with that toothless, unconditional love. But I also learned the bitter taste of humiliation. Friends stopped calling. My family, embarrassed by the scandal, offered sympathy but little else. And every time I saw couples pushing strollers in the park, I felt a sharp ache that bordered on rage. The worst part was hearing about Richard. Through whispers in our old social circles, I learned he was living large. Fancy dinners, beach vacations, a new girlfriend 10 years younger. The man who left me in poverty was now basking in luxury, funded by the money he'd drained from our marriage. One night, while Lena slept beside me in her crib, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of overdue bills. I had $14.27 in my bank account, no health insurance, and no idea how I'd pay next month's rent. That's when the despair almost won. I thought about calling him just once to beg for help. But then I looked at my daughter's tiny hand curled around my finger and realized something. I couldn't control what Richard had done, but I could control what I would do next. That night, I made a promise to myself and to Lena. I would never again let anyone decide my worth. I would crawl, fight, and claw my way out of this pit, and when I stood tall again, it wouldn't be to win Richard back. It would be to prove I never needed him in the first place. The turnaround didn't happen overnight. At first, it was just a series of small, desperate decisions. Survival, not strategy. I started by selling old clothes online, then handmade scarves and baby blankets during late-night sewing sessions while Lena slept. It was barely enough to cover diapers, but it was something. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of control return to my life. One afternoon, a customer messaged me asking if I could make a custom baby gift set for a shower. Blankets, onesies, and a personalized card. It took me 3 sleepless nights to finish the order, but when she left a glowing review and referred 3 friends, a thought sparked in my mind. What if this could be more than a side hustle? I spent my evenings reading free business guides and watching tutorials on product branding and online marketing. I taught myself how to design a simple website, how to photograph my products with natural light, and how to write copy that tugged at a new mother's heart. Slowly, orders started trickling in, first from friends of friends, then from strangers across the country. Every dollar I earned went back into the tiny business I was building. I bought better fabric, upgraded my sewing machine, and invested in packaging that looked professional. My dining table became a workshop. My hallway became a shipping station. My living room, cluttered with fabric swatches and shipping labels, became the headquarters of a dream that was no longer just about survival. It was about freedom. For the first time since Richard walked out, I stopped measuring my life by what I had lost and started measuring it by what I was building. One night, as I rocked Lena to sleep, she reached up and touched my cheek with her tiny hand. "We're going to be okay," I whispered, though she was too young to understand. But the truth was, I finally believed it. What began as scraps of fabric and scraps of hope was slowly becoming the blueprint for something bigger, something that would one day eclipse everything Richard had taken from me. By Lena's second birthday, the tiny online shop that started as a desperate side hustle had become something more, a steady stream of orders, loyal customers, and enough monthly income to keep the lights on without choosing between rent and groceries. I called my business Little Phoenix because, like me, it was born from ashes. The climb was anything but easy. I worked 18-hour days, slept 4 hours a night, and fought off exhaustion that sometimes felt heavier than grief ever had. But every order shipped was a small victory. Every positive review was a reminder that I was no longer powerless. I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. With time, my small Etsy store grew into a website of its own. I expanded my product line, matching mother and baby sets, custom nursery decor, even memory quilts made from cherished baby clothes. My story, the abandoned mother who built a business from nothing, resonated with other women. Soon, my inbox was filled with messages from customers sharing their own stories of heartbreak and resilience. A local parenting magazine ran a feature about Little Phoenix, calling me the mompreneur who turned betrayal into a business empire. Sales exploded overnight. I hired 2 part-time seamstresses and rented a small studio space. For the first time since Richard left, I wasn't just paying bills, I was thriving. But success brought unexpected emotions with it. The stronger I became, the more I realized how deeply Richard's abandonment had scarred me. There were nights I'd stand in the studio, surrounded by bolts of fabric and stacks of packages, and still feel the sting of his betrayal. Not because I missed him, but because I had once believed I was nothing without him. Now, I was proof of the opposite, and yet, beneath the pride, a quiet question lingered. Would he ever regret what he'd done? I didn't know it then, but the answer was coming. And when it arrived, it would walk right back into my life, not as the man who left me, but as a broken shadow of the man who once believed I couldn't survive without him. My focus was exactly where it needed to be, on the life I'd built without him. Little Phoenix was no longer just an online boutique. It had become a brand, a movement, a symbol of resilience for women who had been underestimated and abandoned just like me. By the time Lena turned 5, we had 3 full-time employees, a warehouse for inventory, and a growing list of celebrity clients. Orders poured in from around the world, London, Tokyo, Sydney. I was featured on a national morning show as the single mom CEO who defied the odds. It was surreal, and yet, it felt like everything I had worked for was finally aligning. But the success wasn't just measured in sales or interviews. It was in the way Lena looked at me with admiration when she asked about my company. It was in the nights we danced in the living room, laughing over pizza and cartoons, because life, despite its painful beginnings, had become ours again. One evening, after a long day at the office, I received an email from a major department store chain. They wanted to carry Little Phoenix in all 200 of their locations. The deal would multiply my revenue overnight and establish my brand as a household name. I stared at the screen, tears welling in my eyes. This wasn't just success, it was vindication. I had been left with nothing, and I had turned that nothing into everything. That night, after tucking Lena into bed, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. A quiet smile spread across my face. Richard had once said I'd never survive without him. Now I was living a life he could only dream of, and deep down, I knew he hadn't disappeared forever. People like him always come back when they smell success. And when he did, I would be ready. This time on my terms. I was hunched over the sewing table, the hum of the machine the only heartbeat in the room, when my phone buzzed. A friend had sent a link with a note. "You'll want to see this." The article opened with a photo: bright turquoise water, champagne glasses, and two perfect smiles. "Entrepreneur Richard Reyes and designer Celeste Langford soak up the sun in Santorini," the headline read. They looked like a magazine cover, his arm draped around her bronzed shoulders, her diamond bracelet catching the Greek light. For a moment, I just stared. Not at him, but at the man I used to know, replaced by this polished stranger who had turned my life into a headline I never asked for. While he lounged on yachts, I was here, patching orders, chasing suppliers, eating instant noodles so my daughter could have fresh fruit. The jealousy hit first, sharp and fast. Then something colder, steadier took its place. I zoomed in on the picture. The watch on his wrist was mine. The one I sold so he could afford that first business retreat. My hands stopped shaking. I pinned the printed article above my desk, right beside Lena's drawing of our little workshop. The caption glared at me. "Building their empire together." "Let it drive you," I whispered. I turned back to the machine and started sewing again, faster this time. Every stitch felt like a defiance, a promise that one day he'd look up from whatever luxury villa he was hiding in and realize the empire he bragged about was never his. It was built by the woman he left behind, and she wasn't done yet. 2 months after the Santorini photos, another headline popped up, this one not so glossy. Designer Celeste Langford faces mounting debts after brand sponsorships collapse. I read it twice, then once more, slower. The article detailed everything: unpaid credit lines, canceled contracts, rumors of lawsuits. There was even a paragraph about Richard, former entrepreneur, now under financial strain. It was the kind of polite phrasing journalists used when the truth was uglier than print allowed. According to the piece, Celeste had opened multiple accounts under Richard's business name, charging designer clothes, jewelry, even a weekend in Monaco. When creditors came knocking, she vanished, moved out of their penthouse and into another man's mansion on the coast. Karma, it seemed, didn't knock. It kicked the door in. I wasn't proud of what I did next. I sent an anonymous email to a business columnist I knew from my early vendor days. I attached screenshots, the public records, the shell company filings, the quiet pattern of deceit. Within a week, a story ran. Power couple or Ponzi? The collapse of the Reyes-Langford empire. No one knew the source, but Richard did. He'd always underestimated me, but he knew my precision, my fingerprints of truth. When the story trended, I closed my laptop and stared at the dark screen. My reflection looked calmer than I expected. No laughter, no celebration, just quiet relief. He had once built his life on my loyalty. Now, he was watching his crumble under the same light he'd used to blind me. I didn't need revenge headlines or applause. The truth was louder than both. And it was finally speaking his name. The email subject line read, "Acquisition proposal, urgent." I almost deleted it. Most offers were scams or marketing pitches pretending to be investors. But this one came from a real firm, Halden and Rowe Capital, a name I recognized from industry panels. They wanted to buy Little Phoenix outright. Price, $1 million for a long moment. I just stared at the number. 6 zeros. The kind of figure that could change everything. Pay off the mortgage, secure Lena's future. Silence every financial fear that had ever kept me awake at night. We met 2 days later at a downtown restaurant, the kind with waiters who glide and chandeliers that whisper old money. The senior partner, Mr. Lasker, smiled like a man used to hearing, "Yes. You've built something remarkable," he said smoothly. "But brands like yours plateau. We can take it global, if you sell now, while it's hot." He slid the papers across the table. $1 million, Ms. Reyes. Walk away wealthy, and let us scale it properly. I looked at the pages, my logo, my life's work, my name. The brand born from heartbreak, built on nights of hunger and resolve. Then I pushed the folder back. You can't buy what was built from pain, I said quietly. And you can't own what's already free. Outside, the air tasted clean. For the first time, money didn't tempt me. Power wasn't in the offer, it was in saying no. It started as a whisper in the business pages. Socialite designer Celeste Langford parts ways with entrepreneur Richard Reyes amid financial turmoil. By nightfall, it was everywhere. The story unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. Celeste had been spotted at a charity gala on the arm of billionaire media mogul Alan Roth, older, richer, hungrier for attention. Paparazzi photos showed her laughing in a gown that cost more than my first year of rent, the diamond necklace at her throat glinting like a trophy. The caption beneath the photo was merciless. New love. New life. Langford leaves behind failed ventures and financial scandals. Behind those polished headlines, the truth was harsher. Their penthouse was repossessed. Creditors were circling. Richard's name had become toxic in every investor circle. The same people who toasted him on yachts now crossed the street to avoid being photographed with him. I read the articles with the same calm I used to measure fabric. No rush of joy. A month earlier, I'd been the forgotten one, the woman erased from his narrative. Now it was Celeste, rewritten, replaced, discarded for a shinier version of wealth. The cycle had finally turned on him. That night, as rain tapped against the studio windows, I lit a candle and let the flame dance over the glossy magazine pages I'd once hated to see. His smile was still there, practiced, confident, but now it looked like a mask slipping under heat. Karma didn't need my hand to guide it. It had perfect aim, and it was finally doing what I never had to. The storm hit on a Friday night, the kind of summer squall that turns the sky black in minutes and makes the streetlights blink like they're afraid. I was still at the warehouse, checking the shipment list for the department store launch. 2,000 orders. One weekend to deliver, then the power cut. The machines went silent. Water started seeping under the loading dock doors, pooling around the stacks of boxes we'd spent weeks preparing. For a heartbeat, I froze. The old fear came rushing back, the feeling of helplessness I'd lived with after Richard left. The one that whispered, "You'll lose everything again." Then I heard Lena's voice in my head. "We're going to be okay, Mom. Get the pallets off the floor." I shouted. My two assistants, soaked and shivering, jumped into action. We dragged tables into lines, built makeshift shelves, and worked by flashlight. The rain hammered like fists on the roof, but we didn't stop. Every label, every seal, every box mattered. By midnight, the delivery trucks couldn't reach us. Roads were flooded. I made a call to the drivers anyway. "Meet me 3 blocks up," I said. "We'll bring them to you." We hauled the boxes through ankle-deep water, laughing between breaths, adrenaline keeping us upright. When the last truck pulled away, we stood in the rain, drenched but victorious. The next morning, a customer filmed our soaked team waving as the shipment left. The clip went viral. CEO who shipped through the storm. I didn't need the headline to know what it meant. The woman who once drowned in chaos had learned to command it. One soaked box, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. It was close to midnight when I heard the echo of tires crunching on gravel outside the studio. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. I stepped to the window and saw headlights cut through the rain. Then the engine shut off and he stepped out. Richard. He was wearing a suit too nice for his means and a smile too confident for a man who'd lost everything. The sports car behind him was a rental. I could tell by the tag hanging from the mirror. He adjusted his tie and looked up at my window, like he knew I was there. I met him at the front door before he could knock. "Working late." "As always," he said, his voice slick with practiced charm. "Impressive setup you've got. Maybe we should talk. Press loves a redemption story. Estranged couple reunites after success. Sounds good, doesn't it?" I didn't answer. The rain hissed between us. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Come on, Anna, you've made your point. You've got your little empire, your fans. Why not let me in? We could build something together again. That was the moment I saw it. Desperation behind the grin. He wasn't here for partnership. He was here for access. Say that again? I asked. He smirked. You heard me? I nodded, then stepped back and shut the door. In the morning, the email came from my accountant at 6:42 a.m. Subject line: urgent, possible contamination. At first, I thought it was a scam. Then I opened the attachment. A supplier we'd been using for packaging, Whitestone Logistics, was flagged in a government audit. Their records were cross-linked to Richard's defunct company, Reyes & Co., the one now under investigation for fraud. My stomach dropped. If our invoices looked connected, my brand could be dragged into his mess. Investors, partners, even customers. They'd see headlines, not context. Single mom CEO tied to fraudulent ex-husband. I didn't have the luxury of panic. I called Marianne, my lawyer. Freeze all payments, I said. We audit everything now. Within hours, my office turned into a war room. Paper trails, bank statements, supplier contracts. I hadn't felt this adrenaline since the night I gave birth alone. It wasn't fear this time, it was fury. By noon, we found it. Forged vendor IDs, invoices rerouted through shell accounts Richard had opened years ago under my maiden name. He'd tried to anchor me to his downfall. I drove straight to the Department of Commerce building with the files in a weathered binder. The clerk looked startled when I slammed it on the counter. This belongs to your investigation, I said. It's proof he's been using my name without consent. That night, the story broke online. Ex-husband's fraud uncovered. Little Phoenix cleared of ties. I sat in the dark with a cup of tea, the glow of my laptop washing the room in soft blue. He'd wanted to drag me under with him. Instead, I'd handed the sharks his scent. Sometimes survival isn't quiet, sometimes it roars. A week later, another headline took over every business feed. Celeste Langford breaks her silence. He lied about everything. For a moment, I thought it was clickbait. Then I saw her face, pale, perfectly lit, but hollow around the eyes. The interview was everywhere. Magazines, talk shows, podcasts. She'd finally turned on him. I believed in Richard, she said, voice trembling just enough for sympathy. He told me his company was recovering. He said the money was coming. But it was all smoke. He drained my accounts, forged my signature, and left me in debt. The camera zoomed in, catching the shimmer of her tears. I could almost hear his rehearsed excuses echoing behind her words. The same lies, recycled for a new audience. When the interviewer asked if she regretted leaving him for Alan Roth, Celeste paused. No, she said softly, because it made me see who Richard really was. A man who destroys everything he touches. By the next day, his face was splashed across every business news site. Sponsors cut ties. Former investors demanded audits. Even his old friends started to distance themselves. I watched from my office window as rain streaked down the glass, thinking about the symmetry of it all. I didn't need to gloat. Karma had a rhythm of its own, and it was right on time. Celeste's interview didn't just expose him, it finished him. The man who once believed he could rewrite my story had become a cautionary tale told by the woman who replaced me. Justice hadn't needed my voice this time. It spoke perfectly through hers. The power had gone out again, a rolling blackout across half the city. But I didn't stop working. A single candle flickered on my kitchen table, its small flame lighting the mountain of papers spread before me. Contracts, bank statements, loan records. Each page was a piece of my past, a breadcrumb trail of deceit left by Richard's hands. Marianne sat across from me, her glasses sliding down her nose as she read line after line. He was clever, she murmured. These accounts were designed to look legitimate. I ran a finger along the edge of one document, a business loan application signed with my maiden name, Anna Collins. He'd used it years ago, forging my signature to secure money he never repaid. The total debt now exceeded $200,000. He thought if he fell, he'd take me with him, I said quietly. Then we'll make sure he doesn't, Marianne replied, her tone as sharp as the click of her pen. Together, we built the case. Forged documents, falsified tax IDs, every piece of evidence meticulously arranged in a binder thick as a Bible. When the city lights finally flickered back on, I snapped the cover shut. Tomorrow, I said. We take it to the investigators. The next morning, I walked into the Department of Financial Crimes and placed the binder on the agent's desk. No emotion, no speech. Just the truth, cold, heavy, undeniable. That evening, an email arrived. Formal inquiry opened. Evidence under review. I leaned back, exhaling for the first time in days. He'd once stolen my name to fund his lies. Now that same name would be the one to end him. The weeks that followed felt surreal. The media had turned the collapse of Reyes & Co. into a modern-day morality play. Headlines chronicled every new twist. Fraud charges, frozen accounts, repossessed assets. Richard's name was synonymous with scandal. And while I tried to stay focused on my company, the echoes of his downfall trailed me like distant thunder. Then came the gala. It was the annual Women in Business event, the same one I had attended as a small vendor 5 years earlier, handing out free samples from a folding table. Now I was back as a guest of honor. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and champagne. Every woman in that room had a story, some of struggle, some of triumph. But tonight, they were all cheering for mine. When they called my name, I walked onto the stage beneath a cascade of golden light. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room like a wave. Anna, the host said, smiling at me, before we begin, one quick question that's been trending all afternoon. I felt the air change. She lifted her phone. Reading aloud, reports say your ex-husband, Richard Reyes, has just been indicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Would you like to comment? The crowd hushed. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. I could have laughed. I could have smiled. I could have refused to answer. But this was the moment every long night, every humiliation, every tear had been building toward. I took a breath and leaned toward the microphone. When someone builds their life on lies, I said softly, truth doesn't need to chase them. It just waits, and eventually it does the destroying. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then applause, slow at first, then rising, roaring, alive. Some women stood. Others wiped tears. And I stood there, calm, unmoved, the echo of justice ringing louder than any revenge ever could. I stepped down from the stage, the applause still swelling behind me. I didn't smile for the cameras. I didn't need to. My silence said enough. Somewhere across the city, Richard was probably watching the broadcast, his empire crumbling in real time. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even vindictive. I was free. After the gala, I thought that would be the end of it. But desperation has a way of making people foolish, and Richard had not yet learned when to quit. A month later, a man in a cheap suit appeared at my office door. "You've been served," he said, handing me a thick envelope before walking away. Inside, a petition for joint custody of Lena, and a claim for spousal support. I read it twice, unable to breathe. Richard, the man who had abandoned me while I was pregnant, now wanted a share of the life I built alone. He claimed that my company's success was rooted in assets and intellectual property developed during the marriage. He even had the audacity to allege that I had alienated him from his daughter. It was absurd, insulting, and infuriating. I called Marianne the moment I finished reading. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the disbelief simmering beneath it. "He's reaching, Anna," she said. "He's broke and he's desperate. But if he wants a legal fight, we'll give him one." For weeks, we gathered everything: proof of abandonment, copies of unpaid child support notices, evidence that Little Phoenix was built years after the divorce. Marianne prepared filings that could gut his argument in a single motion. Still, part of me couldn't help but feel the old ache resurface, the humiliation of having to fight the same man who once swore to protect me. But that ache didn't last long. Because this time I wasn't the same woman he had left behind. This time I had power, resources, and a voice that couldn't be silenced. The hearing was scheduled for late autumn. The air outside the courthouse that morning was sharp and cold, but inside I was calm. Richard arrived wearing a borrowed suit and a tired smile. The confidence that once defined him had thinned into nervous bluster. He avoided my eyes as he took his seat beside his underpaid lawyer. When the judge entered, the room shifted from tension to formality. Richard's lawyer began with a performance worthy of a bad soap opera, painting his client as a devoted father who had been unfairly excluded from his daughter's life, and whose financial hardship stemmed from supporting my early ventures. It was almost laughable, but I didn't laugh. When Marianne stood, the tone changed instantly. Her voice was calm but surgical, slicing through every lie with documented truth. Bank statements showing he'd emptied our accounts. Texts where he admitted to abandoning me. Proof that Little Phoenix had been established long after the marriage ended. She presented it all with quiet precision. When my turn came to testify, I spoke simply. Richard didn't build this life, I said. He abandoned it. I built it from nothing, for myself, and for my daughter. He left me when I was sick, broke, and pregnant. Everything I am today exists because I refused to let his choices define me. The courtroom was silent. The judge's decision was swift. Richard's custody request was denied. His spousal support claim was dismissed with prejudice. And instead, the court ordered him to pay years of back child support, with interest. As the gavel struck, I didn't cheer. I didn't even look at him. I just exhaled. 10 years of weight lifted in a single clean sound. For the first time, the story wasn't about what he had taken from me. It was about what I had reclaimed. When I walked out of the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted my name, and microphones reached for comment. I said nothing. I just smiled, holding Lena's small hand as we stepped into the winter sunlight. Behind me, the doors of that courthouse closed. Behind me, so did the last door he would ever try to open. Richard didn't show up for the post-judgment compliance review, a sign, Marianne said, that he knew he'd lost. And he had. The judge's ruling was ironclad. Full custody remained with me. No financial claims were granted, and Richard was legally bound to repay the child support he'd neglected all those years. He had not just lost a legal battle. He had lost every ounce of leverage he thought he still had. But fate wasn't done teaching him lessons. 2 weeks later, a news article appeared online. Former startup CEO declared bankrupt after fraud investigation. Richard's business collapse had triggered an audit, and the findings were damning. Unpaid loans, fabricated investor reports, and tax evasion. The same man who once mocked my little hobby shop was now facing criminal charges and public humiliation. I should have felt vindicated, and part of me did. But another part, the one that had once loved him, just felt sad. Sad for the man who had thrown everything away chasing illusions. Sad for the father who could have been a hero to his daughter, but chose to become a cautionary tale instead. One afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. It was Richard. His voice was barely a whisper. "Anna, they're taking everything. My house, my car, all of it. I don't even have a lawyer anymore." I stayed silent. I want you to know I'm sorry. I wish I'd stayed. I wish I'd been the man you needed me to be. Finally, I spoke. I forgave you a long time ago, Richard. But forgiveness isn't a bridge back into my life. It's just how I set myself free. There was silence on the line, the kind that carries understanding. Then quietly, he hung up. For the first time, I realized I no longer carried anger or hatred for him, only closure. The tables had turned completely. The man who had once left me in ruins was now standing in the rubble of his own choices, while I, the woman he underestimated, stood taller than I ever had. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by survival, but by strength. The court battles were over, the financial storms had calmed, and Little Phoenix was soaring higher than I had ever dreamed. We signed the deal with the department store chain, and my products were now displayed on shelves across the country. Investors reached out, media outlets called for interviews, and the company's revenue doubled in less than 6 months. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Lena and I decorated our living room with paper leaves and fairy lights, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Richard was standing there, thinner, worn, and holding nothing but a small, weathered envelope. "I know I have no right to ask," he said quietly. "But may I speak to you, just once, face to face?" I hesitated, then nodded. We sat on the porch where we had once planned our future. Now, the silence between us spoke louder than any words could. "I lost everything," he admitted. "The money, the business, even my reputation. But losing you and Lena, that's the only thing I truly regret. I was selfish and blind, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed to say this." For a long moment, I just looked at him, not the man who betrayed me, but the man who had to live with the weight of his own choices. Finally, I said, "I forgive you, Richard. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. That door closed a long time ago." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "I understand." When he left that day, there was no bitterness in my heart, only calm. I wasn't forgiving him for his sake. I was forgiving him for mine. It was the final act of power, choosing peace over revenge, dignity over resentment, and freedom over the chains of the past. And as I closed the door, I knew, truly and finally, that I had won. But life has a way of testing the peace you think you've earned. A few months later, Little Phoenix received an invitation to a global entrepreneurship summit in New York. It was an enormous opportunity: exposure, partnerships, international investors. The kind of moment I dreamed of. I accepted the invitation with pride, knowing how far I'd come. The first night of the event, I stood backstage waiting for my turn to speak. The room was filled with hundreds of entrepreneurs, journalists, and business leaders. I adjusted the microphone, glanced down at my note cards, and took a deep breath. When they called my name, the applause was thunderous. I walked onto the stage, smiled, and began. 10 years ago, I had nothing. No money, no support, no direction. I was a single mother, sewing baby blankets at my kitchen table. And today, I stand before you as the founder and CEO of Little Phoenix, a company built from heartbreak, fueled by hope, and inspired by rebirth. Applause swelled again, and I continued. Every woman in this room has faced a moment when someone doubted her. Maybe it was a boss, a partner, a parent, or a lover. But the truth is, doubt is just fear wearing another face. Once you stop believing in their version of you, you start becoming your own. When I stepped off the stage, reporters crowded me with questions. Cameras flashed. For the first time, I didn't feel like the woman who was left behind. I felt like the woman who had finally arrived. 2 days later, while flying home, I looked out the plane window and thought about the strange symmetry of my journey. The woman Richard had walked away from had been scared, dependent, and unsure. The woman I had become was none of those things. I had rebuilt not just my life, but my identity. When we landed, I switched on my phone. There were dozens of messages. Congratulations. From friends, journalists requesting interviews, and one from a number I didn't recognize. It was a photo of Lena and me on stage, smiling beneath the bright lights. Beneath it, a message. I saw the speech. I'm proud of you. Truly. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need to ask who it was from. For a moment, I just stared at it. Then I deleted it, not out of anger, but because I didn't need his approval anymore. His pride, his recognition, it no longer defined me. That night, as I tucked Lena into bed, she wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "Mom, you're my hero." Tears welled in my eyes as I kissed her forehead. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "You're mine." Winter came early that year, the kind that painted frost on the windows and turned every breath into white smoke. Life had finally found its rhythm again, steady, bright, and unapologetically mine. Little Phoenix was thriving. Lena was in school, happy and full of life. And for the first time, my heart wasn't anchored to the past. I was content. Until the past came knocking one last time. It started like a whisper, a notification, a headline. A familiar name. Richard Reyes faces criminal sentencing in federal fraud case. I stared at the words for a long time, not with shock, not even satisfaction, but something quieter. Finality. The man who had once built castles out of deceit was now standing before a judge, stripped of everything he thought made him untouchable. He had built his empire on manipulation. I had built mine on truth. And now the difference was undeniable, but life doesn't pause for poetic justice. While the world read headlines, I was signing expansion papers for Little Phoenix Europe, securing partnerships that would take my brand overseas. The dream I'd once whispered to a newborn in a one-room apartment was no longer a dream. It was a living, breathing reality. Still, the echoes of my past seemed to follow me. One afternoon, as I left a conference, a reporter stopped me outside the venue. "Ms. Reyes, sorry, Ms. Collins, do you have any comment on your ex-husband's sentencing?" he asked, his microphone inches from my face. "Some people are calling this poetic justice. Others say you must feel vindicated." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "What I feel," I said softly, "is free. Justice doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers, and that's enough." The next morning, my quote was everywhere. I didn't mind. Let them write whatever version they wanted. The truth was simple. Richard's story had ended where mine had begun. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at my office. Handwritten, no return address. My assistant assumed it was fan mail. We received hundreds of those now. But the handwriting stopped me. It was shaky, uneven, familiar. It was from him. "Anna," it began. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to read this. But I need you to know that I understand now. Every lie I told, every excuse I made, it wasn't about business. It was about fear. I was terrified of failing, of not being enough. And instead of admitting that, I ran. I ran from you, from responsibility, from love. You deserved more than I ever gave. You built something pure from the wreckage I caused. And for that, I am proud of you." I stopped there, unable to read further for a moment. The words blurred on the page, not from tears of sadness, but from the weight of what they represented. Accountability. The thing I had begged for years ago. The thing that had finally arrived too late to matter. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where I kept Lena's old baby blanket and her first handmade onesie. The box of beginnings. It felt right to keep it there. A final chapter stored beside the moment our story truly started. Spring brought change, the kind that blooms quietly, without announcement. Little Phoenix had become more than a company. It had become a movement. We launched mentorship programs for single mothers, funded scholarships for women rebuilding their lives, and opened community workshops across 3 cities. And yet, even with all the success, I still carried the memories of the nights I had once cried myself to sleep. Not as wounds anymore, but as proof of how far I had come. One afternoon, as I reviewed quarterly reports, Lena ran into my office holding a newspaper. "Mom, you're on the front page again!" She was right. The headline read, "From Abandonment to Empire, Anna Collins and the Rise of Little Phoenix." There was a photo of me standing in front of our headquarters, smiling. "You're famous," she said proudly, her eyes wide. I smiled back. "No, sweetheart. I'm just living proof that we can start over." She looked thoughtful for a moment, then asked, "Do you think Dad reads these stories?" The question hit like a soft echo of an old ache. "Maybe," I said quietly. "But that's not what matters anymore." She nodded. "Yeah, we're doing fine without him," and she was right. We were. A month later, I was invited to a national women's leadership conference. During the keynote session, the host introduced me as the woman who rose from abandonment to empowerment. The applause that followed was thunderous. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about business models or marketing strategies. I talked about pain, about loss, about starting over. I used to think revenge was justice, I told them, that if I proved my worth, it would undo what was done to me. But I've learned that revenge fades the moment it's fulfilled. What lasts is peace, the kind that comes from knowing you rebuilt your life with integrity. That's the truest kind of victory. When I finished, the entire room stood. Women clapped, cried, hugged each other. In that moment, I realized the story that began with betrayal had transformed into something larger than me. It had become hope for others. Later that night, back at the hotel, I sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights. My phone buzzed with messages, friends, journalists, partners. But one text made me pause. It was from an unknown number. "Thank you for what you said today," it read. "You don't know me, but your story saved my life. I was about to give up, but now I know I can start again." I stared at the message, my heart swelling with something that felt bigger than pride. That was it, the real reason for everything. Not revenge, not proving myself, but giving others a way to see that even in ruin, life can begin again. When I returned home, Lena greeted me at the door with open arms. "How was your trip?" she asked. "It was wonderful," I said, smiling. "I think I helped some people," she grinned. "Of course you did. You always do." That night, as she drifted to sleep, I stood by her door, watching her breathe peacefully. The same little girl who once held my finger in a cramped apartment was now the heartbeat of everything I'd built. And as I turned off the light, I whispered a promise to myself, a promise of continuation. No matter what came next, I would never again let someone else write my story. I had lived through the ending once, and I had rewritten it beautifully. Spring arrived like a quiet promise, washing away the remnants of the storm I had weathered. The air felt lighter, the days longer, and for the first time in years, I could look at my reflection without seeing the woman Richard had abandoned. I saw a survivor, a builder, a mother, a CEO. Little Phoenix had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. We launched new product lines, expanded into Europe, and even secured a partnership with a global retail brand. I was invited to speak at women's business conferences, sharing my journey from rock bottom to CEO, not as a tale of revenge, but as proof that strength is born from pain. One evening, Lena and I sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. She was 8 now, bright, curious, and strong-willed. "Mom," she said, turning to me with a seriousness that only children can summon, "do you think Dad will ever come back?" I took a deep breath before answering. "Maybe he'll try, but we don't need him to." She nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. "I think we're perfect, just us." I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from pride. She didn't see herself as abandoned or broken. She saw herself as whole, loved, and enough. And in that moment, I knew I had succeeded in the most important thing, protecting her heart from the weight of his choices. Later that night, as I reviewed the company's quarterly reports, an email notification appeared. It was from Richard. "Thank you for forgiving me. I'm trying to rebuild my life. I hope one day Lena will let me be part of hers, even a small part." I didn't reply. Some stories don't need an ending. Some chapters are meant to stay closed. I closed my laptop and stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. I had spent years fighting for survival, but now I was living, truly living, on my own terms. And that, I realized, was the sweetest revenge of all. 3 months later, I received a certified letter in the mail. At first, I assumed it was legal paperwork, another desperate attempt from Richard to insert himself into our lives. But when I opened the envelope, I found something unexpected, a handwritten letter, several pages long, stained in places with what looked like water or tears. He wrote about the nights he lay awake in the small, bare apartment he now rented, thinking about the life he'd thrown away, about how his new relationship had been built on lies and selfishness, and how, without family, without purpose, it had crumbled to dust. He confessed that he had seen photos of Lena online and cried, realizing he was a stranger to his own daughter. I thought success meant money, freedom, excitement, he wrote. But real success was the home you built, the love you gave, the sacrifices you made. And I threw it all away for nothing. At the end of the letter, he asked for nothing. Not money, not another chance. Only one thing. When she's old enough, please tell Lena that I loved her, and that leaving was the biggest mistake of my life. I sat there in silence for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. I didn't feel satisfaction or triumph, just a deep, quiet sadness for the man he could have been and for the family we might have had. But I also felt peace, because accountability, not apologies, was what I had always needed. And now, at last, he was owning his choices. 2 years later, my life looked nothing like the one Richard had walked away from. Our company headquarters, a bright, airy building with my name etched on the glass doors, bustled with more than 40 employees. Little Phoenix had grown into an international brand, and I had become a keynote speaker at business summits, telling rooms full of aspiring entrepreneurs about resilience, rebuilding, and the strength that comes from being underestimated. Lena thrived too. She was top of her class, bold and creative, and already talking about starting her own business someday. "I'm going to be a CEO like you," she said one night as I tucked her into bed. My heart swelled with pride. Everything I had fought for, every tear I had shed, it was all worth it for this moment. Richard's name still appeared occasionally, a request for visitation, a note passed through a lawyer about wanting to know his daughter. I never denied Lena the choice to know her father, but I made sure she understood the truth. When she was ready, she could decide for herself. And she did. "Mom," she said one afternoon, "I don't want to see him. Maybe one day, but not now." "I'm happy with you," I smiled gently. "That's okay, sweetheart. You get to choose what's right for you." And in that moment, I realized I had chosen too. Not bitterness, not revenge, but peace. The man who had abandoned me no longer defined me. The pain he caused no longer controlled me. My story was no longer about being left behind. It was about rising, rebuilding, and thriving beyond what anyone, including him, thought possible. As I stood on the balcony that evening, watching the city lights glow beneath the stars, I whispered a quiet thank you to the woman I used to be, the one who refused to give up, even when she had nothing left. Because in the end, my greatest victory wasn't that Richard regretted leaving. It was that I no longer needed him to. I had created a life more beautiful than any apology could ever repair. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges. I rarely thought about him anymore. My days were full: meetings with partners in Europe, mentorship programs for young women, charity initiatives through the Phoenix Foundation, which provided grants and training for single mothers starting over. Each success, each smiling face reminded me of how far I'd come, and how deeply I had transformed pain into purpose. Then, one afternoon, I received a message from Richard's sister, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "He's been ill," the message read. "He asked me to let you know. He doesn't have much time left." I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me felt nothing. Another part, the part that had once loved him, felt a quiet, unexpected ache. After everything that had happened, I didn't hate Richard. I didn't wish him pain, but I also didn't feel the need to go to him. His journey, like mine, was now his own. Instead, I wrote him a letter. It was brief and honest. Not a declaration of love, not an invitation to reconcile, but a simple acknowledgement that I wished him peace. I hope you find forgiveness, not from me, but from yourself, I wrote. We are both more than the worst choices we've made. I never knew if he read it. I never saw him again, but I didn't need to. The chapter had already ended. The man who once defined my heartbreak was now just a story I used to tell, one that no longer held power over me. And as I watched Lena run through the garden that evening, laughing in the golden glow of the setting sun, I felt the final piece of my heart settle. The past no longer hurt. It simply was, and I was finally completely free. The following year marked a decade since Richard had left, and with it came a milestone I never thought I'd reach. The grand opening of the Phoenix Center, a community hub I built in our city for single mothers, survivors of abandonment, and women starting over. It wasn't just a business project. It was the embodiment of every tear I'd cried, every night I'd stayed awake worrying about the future. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was emotional. The mayor attended. So did journalists, investors, and women whose lives had been changed by our foundation. And as I stood on that stage, Lena, now 10 years old and taller than my shoulder, held my hand and beamed with pride. My mom is the strongest person I know, she said during her small speech. Because when life knocked her down, she built something better. I had to fight back tears as the audience erupted into applause. That moment, more than the money, more than the success, was my true victory. Because my daughter wasn't growing up with bitterness or fear. She was growing up with resilience, compassion, and strength. Years continued to pass, and with each one the scars of my past faded into quiet lessons rather than open wounds. Lena grew into a confident, brilliant teenager, the kind who spoke her mind without fear, and carried herself with a sense of worth I had fought hard to instill. Watching her become the young woman I once dreamed she could be was my greatest accomplishment of all. The Phoenix Center flourished, expanding to 3 more cities. Thousands of women passed through our doors, some broken, some angry, some terrified of starting over. But every single one of them left stronger than they had arrived. And each time I heard a success story, I was reminded that my suffering had not been in vain. It had been the soil from which new hope could grow, not just for me, but for others too. One evening, after speaking at a national conference about resilience and entrepreneurship, a woman approached me in tears. "Your story saved my life," she said. "I was going to give up after my husband left me. But then I read about you and thought, if she can do it, so can I. Now I run my own business too." I hugged her tightly, humbled and deeply moved. I had once believed my story was one of betrayal and abandonment, but it had become something far more powerful. It was now a blueprint for others to rise from their lowest points. That night, as Lena and I sat by the fireplace sipping hot cocoa, she looked up from her homework and asked, "Mom, do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" I thought about it. The pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal. And then I smiled. "No," I said softly. "Because if they had, we wouldn't be here." And it was true. I no longer wished Richard had stayed. His absence had forced me to become everything I was meant to be. And in doing so, I had created a legacy, not just a company or a center, but a life built on strength, resilience, and unshakable self-worth. The night before Lena's high school graduation, I stood alone in the garden, the same patch of soil where, years ago, I had once sat crying with a newborn in my arms, unsure how I would make it through the next day. Now, under a sky full of stars, I felt a peace so deep it almost felt unreal. Life had come full circle. The woman I was back then, frightened, abandoned, broken, no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more resilient. I had built an empire from my pain. I had turned betrayal into a legacy, and I had raised a daughter who knew her worth from watching her mother fight for hers. Lena walked out onto the porch, her graduation gown draped over her arm. "Mom," she said, smiling softly, "I want you to know everything I am, everything I'm becoming, it's because of you." Tears filled my eyes as I pulled her into a hug. No, baby. It's because of us. Because we never gave up. The next day, as she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, my heart swelled with pride. She wasn't just graduating. She was stepping into a world where nothing would ever hold her back. And deep down, I knew that everything I had endured was worth it for this moment. After the ceremony, as we posed for photos, someone mentioned they had seen Richard standing quietly at the back of the crowd. I didn't turn to look. I didn't need to. His presence no longer stirred anger or sorrow, just a distant sense of closure, because this was the life I had built without him. And it was beautiful. Later that night, as the two of us shared ice cream on the porch under a canopy of summer stars, I whispered a silent promise to myself. Never again would I let someone else's choices define my worth. I had been broken, yes, but I had rebuilt. And the woman I had become was stronger than anything that had tried to destroy her. A few months after Lena's graduation, I received a call I wasn't expecting. Richard's sister again. Her voice was gentle, but I knew what she was going to say before she said it. Anna, Richard passed away last night. For a long moment, I just sat there in silence. There was no rush of tears, no shock, no anger. Just stillness. I thanked her for letting me know and ended the call. And then I sat quietly, staring out the window as the late afternoon sun streamed through the curtains. It was strange, how someone who had once been the center of my world could become a distant chapter, closed and sealed. I didn't hate Richard. I didn't even resent him anymore. If anything, I felt pity for the choices he made, for the love he threw away, and for the man he never allowed himself to become. A week later, I received another letter, this one from his lawyer. Richard had written a final message for Lena and me, leaving behind a few personal belongings and a handwritten apology. He had also requested to be buried quietly, with no service. I respected that. I didn't attend the burial. Instead, on the day of his funeral, Lena and I visited the little lake where he had once proposed to me, a place that, despite everything, still held good memories. We tossed a handful of wildflowers into the water and watched them float away. Goodbye, I whispered, not to the man who left, but to the pain that had followed me for so long. As the ripples carried the petals farther from shore, I realized this was the final piece of healing. There was nothing left to forgive, nothing left to prove. His story had ended, but mine was still being written, boldly, beautifully, and entirely on my terms. That night, I slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in years. And when I woke up, the weight I had carried for over a decade was gone. The past no longer had a hold on me. My life, my future, was fully, gloriously my own. Life after Richard's death was quieter, not in a sorrowful way, but in the way the sea calms after a long, relentless storm. The waves still lapped at the shore of my memory, but they no longer crashed violently. They simply were, part of a landscape that had shaped me but no longer defined me. Lena had started college by then, studying business, just like her mother. "I'm going to make something of my own, Mom," she told me on move-in day, her eyes shining with the same determination I once carried in my 20s. "Something you'll be proud of," I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I already am." With Lena away, I poured my energy into the Phoenix Foundation, expanding our programs and launching a mentorship initiative for single parents rebuilding their lives. The stories I heard, of women fleeing abusive marriages, of fathers raising children alone after being abandoned, reminded me that my journey wasn't unique. It was part of a larger universal struggle for dignity, hope, and self-worth. One evening, I stood in my garden, the same patch of earth where I had once buried my pain, and watched the sun dip below the horizon. The air smelled of lavender and fresh rain. For the first time in my life, I felt complete. I whispered into the wind, a message I knew would never be answered. "I forgive you, Richard, for everything, and I hope wherever you are, you've found peace too." It wasn't for him. It was for me. A final act of release, a gentle closing of the last door to the past. The life I had built was no longer about survival or revenge. It was about purpose. It was about love, for myself, for Lena, and for the thousands of people whose lives I could now touch. The woman who had once been left behind had become a force too powerful to abandon. And as the stars blinked awake overhead, I realized something profound. My story wasn't one of betrayal after all. It was a story of becoming, and I had finally, truly become free. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.